Welcome to Takeshi's Bench, where you can discuss all things philosophical. In this episode, I'd like to start talking about Japanese philosophy. Since I'm a specialist of Japanese philosophy, I'd like to show you how we can systematically start the study of Japanese intellectual tradition, especially in the context of philosophy. I'm assuming that my viewers know nothing about Japanese philosophy but curious about what's actually available. You might be familiar with Japanese culture through anime, manga, pop songs, or YouTube clips about strange thing about Japanese culture, so on and so forth. But then you might also be interested in an intellectual history of Japan. But if you remember my first episode of What's Your Philosophy, the number of people who are actually specializing in comparative and Asian philosophy is quite small. So if you take a philosophy courses, it's very unlikely for you to learn anything about Japanese philosophy. So in this episode and onwards, I'd like to actually describe or give you a systematic introduction to the history of Japanese philosophy. So the first step you're going to take in this journey of getting to know Japanese philosophy is this, the term sourcebook. I would like you to remember this term sourcebook because this is going to appear in every single book that you're going to read from this year onwards. That is the abbreviation of the book called Japanese Philosophy, a Sourcebook. The publication of this book took place in 2011. So Japanese Philosophy, a Sourcebook published through University of Hawai'i Press in 2011. This is a monumental publication in the sense that it set forth the definition of what counts as Japanese philosophy, and many works after that basically follow this book. So what is really amazing about the Sourcebook is that it has the best framework. So if you're going to actually see the map of what's available as Japanese philosophy, I don't think there is any other book that actually gives you a much more comprehensive framework than this one. But also I like to point two elements that are actually makes this book stand out in relation to all the other books for the function of introducing Japanese philosophy. First element is expanding the notion of philosophy. And the second element, he argues that philosophy is no longer just European. Let me briefly explain these two excellent elements of this book. I don't know if you remember the first episode on Chinese philosophy, but I talked about the importance of paying attention to the emphasis on difference and sameness when we read any works on comparative and Asian philosophy or any non-Western philosophical text. Sourcebook actually does the same thing. He actually tried to pay attention to the profound sameness and radical differences between European and Japanese philosophy. So in other words, this book argues that Japanese philosophy is distinct from European philosophy in that a set of discussions which Japanese intellectuals carried out in their process of understanding their sense of self and their surrounding world had to take place in their given historical context. That is to say, generally speaking, the works of Japanese thinkers are quite different from what is traditionally conceived as European philosophy, both in terms of form and content. But these discussions render a record of their intellectual struggles that shaped their culture and language. Just as European philosophy was integral to the historical formation of their cultures and languages. So by challenging the conventional framework of philosophy as distinctly European and presumably universal and only form of philosophizing, the Sourcebook set the tone that the intellectual history of Japan must be studied as a specific form of philosophy integral to the formation of the Japanese culture and language. Now, this methodological argument is widely received among the specialists of comparative and Japanese philosophy. So usually the books that come after 2011 on Japanese philosophy tend to follow the methodological foundation provided by this Sourcebook. Now, by challenging the conventional framework of philosophy and try to place the Japanese philosophy as a distinct form of philosophizing in relation to European and other forms of philosophy, this book tries to define the specific characteristics of what counts as Japanese philosophy. And it pays attention to the native resources. So that is to say, the intellectual history of Japan has these resources, intellectual resources that are distinct to their own historical and cultural context, which are not available in Anglo-European intellectual tradition. And they use these materials for their process of self-understanding and their comprehensive understanding of the world. These native resources are divided by the three categories, usually the historical category or traditions or themes. Let me briefly talk about these distinctions of native resources and also briefly talk about the problem that this book has as an introduction to Japanese philosophy. When you take a look at the whole intellectual history of Japan, it's very important to keep three categories in your mind, especially when you read so-called pre-modern Japanese philosophical text, which predates mid-19th century. It's very easy for readers to actually get lost where they are. So sometimes when you actually read medieval philosophical text from Japan, and then you go suddenly like, okay, I have no idea what I'm reading and how this is actually relevant to philosophical discussions. So it's very important for readers of Japanese intellectual texts to know where you are in relation to the cultural and historical and intellectual context in which these texts are written. So these three distinctions are called the traditional distinctions or historical distinctions or thematic distinctions. So you usually divide the history of philosophy into three categories. And these three categories are interchangeable. So for instance, if you look at the traditions, you can see how the rise and fall of a certain tradition in relation to different historical period, and also how each tradition deals with different themes in relation to different historical period in which their discussions are made. I think it's very difficult to cover three categories in a single book, because if you talk about traditions and history, sometimes it's repetitive to talk about themes, and then when you talk about themes, you would have to cover both tradition and historical categories. So usually a book or comprehensive overview of Japanese intellectual history tends to take one or two of these. Now, Sourcebook actually takes traditions and themes as the basic category for them to show you an overview of intellectual history of Japan. For traditions, they included native Shinto tradition, Confucianism, Buddhism, and then modern academic philosophy. Now, modern academic philosophy doesn't correspond with the modern academic philosophy in a European philosophical context. Modern academic philosophy in Japan starts from mid-19th century. That's when the term philosophy is imported from European intellectual context to Japanese intellectual context. So up until the middle of 19th century, they didn't even have a term philosophy. Now you can see this clear division between philosophy as a European project and thought as distinctly Japanese. The problematic distinction between what counts as a philosophy and what doesn't count as a philosophy already started with this beginning of academic philosophy in Japan. Now, the first three categories are distinctly native to Japanese intellectual traditions. Oftentimes, they are discussed as integral streams of thought that constitute the whole of Japanese intellectual tradition. So Shinto native tradition is something very native to Japanese islands, but then Confucianism and Buddhism came from China and much earlier in the history of Japan. Therefore, Shinto native traditions and Confucianism, Buddhism are usually integral parts of intellectual history of Japan. So modern academic philosophy, of course, takes into account European intellectual traditions, but sometimes they derive their intellectual resources from Shinto native, Confucian, or Buddhist intellectual traditions. So when you actually read, let's say, one academic philosophical text from early 20th century, you'll be able to actually detect some of the influences from these traditions. It's very difficult for us to say this person only has Buddhist influence and this person does not have any Shinto influence. Sometimes they are so integral to each other that the one discussion insinuates the background knowledge of the other intellectual traditions. But usually you'll be able to actually say, look, he is a Zen Buddhist, so he belongs to the Zen tradition, regardless of the fact that he uses some of the Confucian concepts. Then you can say the same thing about Confucian thinker. He is generally considered as a Confucianist, regardless of the fact that he uses some of the Buddhist notions. So when you pay attention to the intellectual history of Japan, you have to have these four categories in your mind. So are you talking about Shinto native thinker, or are you talking about Confucian thinker, Buddhist thinker, or modern academic philosopher? And depending on which tradition they belong to, the way in which you read their texts will be different. And also their emphasis will be different as well. The second category that the Sourcebook uses is the themes, culturally specific themes that are often discussed in relation to the intellectual history of Japan, are cultural identity or samurai thought, which is considered to be the invention of 19th century, but it tries to give you a narrative that covers the history of Japan. And then woman philosopher, aesthetics, right? Japanese aesthetics, and then bioethics, which is supposedly longer than the European tradition of bioethics. So these themes often talk about different thinkers that belong to different traditions that goes beyond a certain historical period. So it's very important to pay attention to these traditions and themes. Sourcebook talks about these 4 traditional categories and then 5 themes. So if you pay attention to the table of contents, that's basically give you the map of the entire history of Japanese philosophy by referring to the traditional and thematic categories. So what are the problems? I just said that this is the best framework in which you can actually see the whole map of intellectual history of Japan. If you teach Japanese philosophy 101, this is the book that everybody should have. But what are the structural problems? There are some flaws. You might have noticed from other episodes that there is not such a thing as a perfect book that answers every question that you have in your life. One book cannot do everything. So you have to read more than one book, unfortunately. But this book has a certain structural problems specific to it, which are a fragmentation. First of all, the source book gives you samples, gives you the list of thinkers that belong to different traditions and themes, and then short introduction and short translation from the original text. But these samples are like trying to explore the new music genre at iTunes or Amazon Music Download. When you actually go to iTunes or Amazon Music Download to actually test the new music, you hear 20 seconds or 30 seconds of the song or even shorter. And sometimes these samples are really great, that they give you the sense of what music is about. But sometimes they also give you a strange part that you don't really know what to do with, right? So reading through Sourcebook would give you samples from different thinkers, but these samples are not always representative of the thinkers that they are introducing. Also, we have this problem with Lost in Translation. Do you remember the movie Lost in Translation when Bob is casted for this commercial, right? The director of the film comes in and talks, you should do this and you should do that. And the translator comes in, say, with more intensity. And he goes, are you sure? I think he's saying more than just more intensity, right? I think the same thing is happening. Even though the Sourcebook actually introduces these thinkers from the intellectual history of Japan, I would say more than 80% of what is available in the intellectual history of Japan are not translated into any European languages. Scholars of Japanese philosophy have a lot more work to do to make these texts available in European languages. It is not really a problem for the Sourcebook, but it is a problem that we would have to confront when we use the Sourcebook for introduction to Japanese philosophy. Also, I'd like to actually talk about this in a separate episode, academic negligence of Japanese philosophy in general, with a reference to this famous book called The Taking Back Philosophy, published in 2017. Not only the problem of the ways in which we can use Sourcebook, but also the ways in which we can receive Sourcebook in academia, for instance, heightens some of the structural problems that we would face when we use this book. But other than that, this is the book that you should have in your bookshelf if you're interested in Japanese philosophy or the comprehensive map of what is conceived as philosophy in reference to the intellectual history of Japan. Unfortunately, reading from the front to back doesn't give you the concrete, detailed picture of Japanese philosophy. So you still have to read individual thinkers and individual traditions to give you a sense of what's available in the intellectual history of Japan. But it's a start. You should have this as a first step toward your understanding of the history of Japanese philosophy. Okay, if you made it this far, you should definitely like this video, and also if you're interested in philosophy, please subscribe to this channel, Takeshi's Bench. If you have any questions about philosophy or comments, arguments, and ideas on all things philosophical, please send them to us through comments below. We will try to pick some of them for the future episodes. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.